Hello and welcome. Today we are going to be discussing evidence for evolution. So last week you should have completed reading notes on these different types of evidence. So I wanted to make sure that we understood these types of evidence and really how they are significant and how they support the theory of evolution by natural selection. So as you are watching the video today, please follow along with the Google Doc that's attached to this assignment so that you can make sure you use it then on the upcoming quiz this week. Okay, so let's get started. So there are 6 different types of evidence that I'm going to be going over with you today. And I think this is the order that I will be addressing these. So we're going to go into different types of anatomical structures and how they provide evidence. We'll get into development and of as a way to form this anatomy. We'll also be going over then the distribution of organisms and how geological concepts like how fossils occur will provide evidence for evolution. And then we will end with the fossil record. And before that, we will get to DNA evidence. And DNA evidence is of the utmost significance. DNA evidence has really provided much of that significant evidence needed in order to support these concepts and mechanisms that go into the theory of evolution. So the first one, homologous structures. These are going to be structures that are going to have different functions in organisms, but they develop from a similar gene or the same gene, and as they go through that development process, they're going to take on a different final form. But that internal structure is still going to be very similar because it has originated from a very similar gene. And what this shows is common ancestry. So, well, where did you get this gene then that was allowing for this similar structure, maybe bone pattern, that came from a common ancestor? A really good example of a homologous structure would be like your forearm. Your forearm here has one bone, two bones, lots of bones, and then your digits within your 5 fingers. And that's going to be very similar for us, for your cat or dog at home, a whale, and even a bat. And if we think, what do all of these organisms have in common? Well, they're all mammals. So we originated from a common mammal ancestor. And even going further, you're going to be able to see these similar bone patterns and structures in many other organisms, especially all tetrapod organisms. So homologous forelimbs of vertebrates, like I said, are going to be a very good example of a homologous structure. And this would have originated not just in our mammal ancestor, but like I said, the ancestor to all tetrapods or four-legged animals. And you can see this, we can see this in fossil evidence of those intermediary species that came from water to land with those 4 different appendages. You don't just see this with bone structure, though. This is any anatomical structure, could be homologous. You could even have homologous genes as well, because genes will ultimately determine that structure. So here's an example with plants. These are all plants that have these homologous structures from a leaf. So some have different functions now, like a pitcher plant, to be able to digest insects that will give them the necessary nitrogen and phosphorus that they need. Venus flytrap, these are their leaves. Poinsettias, this is not the petal, but this is going to be the leaf. So it's going to have that bright, vibrant color to attract its pollinators. And then the cactus, it has an adaptation of its leaves that are needles, but they have very pointy leaves that are going to minimize surface area and minimize the water loss, as well as add some protection for its environment. Now, this is not to be confused with something called analogous structures. Analogous structures are going to have similar functions because that organism in its environment plays a very similar role, and they would have a very similar environment in which they live. So therefore, they would have to have adaptations that have similar functions. Analogous structures might be very similar on the outside and have a very similar function of how the organism uses it, but how those structures then actually develop are going to be very different. So think of a bat wing versus a bird wing. They're going to develop their wings differently, or an insect wing. These are all analogous structures, so have similar function because of similar selective pressure, but they don't show common ancestry. So these are structures that would have evolved independently for a similar function, but again, they do not show that common ancestry, just a similar selection pressure. So if their favorable environment is the air, and they have this adaptation which they can use it, then that shows that it is that common environment or selective pressure, but not common ancestry. So one example, so let's talk about a shark and a dolphin. A shark has a skeleton, but it's made of cartilage, whereas a dolphin is bone. Shark uses gills to get oxygen from its environment. The dolphin has to swim to the surface and exchange those gases with air, not water. Sharks do not nurse their young, but dolphins do. Sharks do not have hair, but dolphins, they are born with a little bit of hair around their nose. So is this an example of homologous structures, because they look very similar, or analogous structures? And if you said analogous, you were correct. So they both live in a very similar environment in the ocean. So therefore, they have very similar selective pressures, and that's why they have developed these streamlined bodies and these fins that allow them to best use their environment. But it does not show that they are closely related. Again, analogous structures, similar selective pressures. Homologous would be the common ancestor. So analogy, sharks and dolphins, they're independently evolving of their adaptations, again, just because of natural selection and similar selective pressures. So if we were to look at this cladogram, we are going to see that these shark fishes and the dolphins shared a common ancestor right here, but they are not very closely related if you look at other species. So you would say that an amphibian is more closely related to that dolphin than the shark is. So vestigial structures are going to be structures that we have, but that natural selection really isn't acting on because we don't really use those structures. And if we don't use them, then it's going to be hard for natural selection to give one organism an advantage if they have that over the other. But what they do show is common ancestry. Again, if we go back to the genes, well, genes are going to allow you to develop different traits. And if you have this similar development, therefore you have similar genes, it's going to show common ancestry. Vestigial structures also could be considered homologous structures because they are originating from the similar gene or a same gene. One example of your homologous structures would be your tailbone. You don't use it anymore, but it's not doing anything or it's not harming you. So therefore, natural selection is not going to act against it, and we're going to just keep it around until that changes. We can see that in whales, they actually do have leftover or vestiges of their pelvis and femur from when they used to have those 4 different legs, but they do not have them anymore. Some other examples, nictitating membrane, or third molar, or wisdom tooth. Other examples of things that we have that are vestiges from common ancestors, but that we don't use anymore. So again, with structures and development originating from genes, we can also look at embryonic development, and we can see how similar these structures are. And again, going back to DNA and genes, that they would have to have common genes in order to have this similar development plan. So one thing then that we can see with all vertebrates is that they're going to have very similar embryos, that they have this notochord that stretches, that they have a tail, and you even at one point in time had a tail when you were a fetus growing through your development. You also then had these gill slits. So if we look at these four different vertebrate embryos, you can notice that they have very, very similar characteristics. Looks like they each have four of these nubs, or for some of these are going to turn into appendages. They have the notochord, that you have your gill slit, like I said, and your tail. So this one actually is a cat, this is a cow, this is a horse, and this is a human. So very similar development structure, again showing common ancestry because they would have very similar genes. So vertebrate embryos then are going to develop those same structures, even though the adult forms do look different. But just as you go through that development, it's going to have very similar genes that are going to control these different body part placements. A lot of these are going to be something called Hox genes that are going to determine like where your head goes, where your legs go, your body symmetry. So again, this shows that all vertebrates have that common ancestor because we have these similar embryos, and these embryos develop similar patterns. So this is how your homologous structures are produced. Again, they're going to go through similar development because of similar genes, but that end result is going to be different depending on where they have their selective pressures and where their environment is. So best evidence absolutely is your DNA similarities. DNA has provided so much supporting evidence for how these differences can arise, but then also how common ancestors and how closely related species are based on that ability to pass on their genes. And if you pass on your genes, then it's from parent to child, and you can trace that back to see where these species diverged from one another. So if we think about a very close relative to us, the chimpanzees, we actually, if we were to send our DNA samples out, we have about 95% of the exact same DNA. So for all organisms, we all follow the same basic biochemical process. So we all take our DNA, and from our DNA convert it to RNA and then make proteins out of it. All of our proteins are made out of the 20 same amino acid, depending on if you are a banana or if you are a human. This is going to happen exactly the same way. We are all going to be using enzymes, which are proteins, to allow for our metabolism to happen and for all of our chemical reactions to happen. And again, where does all of that come from? It comes from DNA. DNA, the more closely related you are, the more common DNA sequences of bases you will have. So if we compare a human to, let's say, a rhesus monkey or a mouse, chicken, frog, or a lamprey, which is not a vertebrate, you are going to have differences in terms of the DNA sequence. So we'd be much more closely related to this rhesus monkey than the frog. But we don't even just have to look at DNA, we can also look at that protein. So in this case, this is actually measuring the hemoglobin protein, the polypeptide. And because DNA codes for protein, you can look at the percent that's similar between those hemoglobin protein compounds, and that's going to give you the same evidence. Now, DNA is better than protein just because there are some codons, right? They can code for the same amino acid using that codon chart or codon wheel, but it does give you a really good inference. Geographical distribution of living organisms. So again, this ties back a little bit to analogous structures, but you can see that if you have very similar ecosystems, that you are going to have possibly very similar adaptations. But then if you have very different animals, even in similar ecosystems, then that's going to show you that this change has occurred and that the common ancestor that started this particular environment is going to have a different set of genes that it was passing on. So if we think about mammals in Europe versus Australia. Well, rabbits are going to live a lot in Europe, but you're going to have your, let's say, kangaroos that are going to be living in Australia. And even though they have a very similar environment, their body structures are different because they started from that different common ancestor, mammal ancestor. You can also see that closely allied species tend to be found on the same continent or similar geographically. So those that you are going to have certain adaptations for are going to be found usually in one particular area of the world, and you're not going to see it across the world entirely because of natural selection. So one example, again, if we go back to those marsupials, most of the marsupials that you're going to find are going to be in Australia. And if you think of Australia, it's very secluded compared to the rest of the continents. It's not like Asia and Europe where they are together. Or even the short distance to Africa, but that because of how isolated it is, you're going to find very different species, even though you have very similar ecosystems. So here just shows you then if you were to have this common ancestor that may have originated, let's say, in Africa, but you have those distinct differences that happen because as those organisms migrate, those gene pools are going to start off with different variation of alleles. So here's your marsupials in Australia that you have. Some other ones, you have your koala, wombat. But then again, how they develop is going to be different. Even though they are mammals, they started with that different common mammal ancestor and therefore have different adaptations. All right, and then lastly, the fossil record. The fossil record really does provide a lot of supporting evidence as well, but just not quite to the level that DNA does. But these were really important when Darwin and Wallace were first doing their research into this mechanism of natural selection to be able to see that life changes, that life does change over time. So the fossil record can show this. The fossil record can also show those extinct species that are no longer here today, and that can help with some of that transitionary fossil evidence that one would expect to find. It's not just finding fossils to find fossils, but the level in which you are going to find fossils is also going to give you some supporting evidence. So most fossils are found in the sedimentary rock. A fossil is just any remain or imprint of ancient life. And the deeper that you go, according to the law of superposition, the older the fossils are going to be. So if you know you're looking for a particular transitionary species and you know when that might have occurred, then you can go looking at rock of that particular age according to this law, and you could then try to find some of those supporting evidence details with those transitionary fossils. So that might have gone from, let's say, the water to land, what might that transitionary species have looked like? So again, this shows all organisms living today and that they might slowly evolve over time, but it also then provides that evidence that life has changed. Here's an example of your modern horse compared to the ancestor that we have been able to find a lot of these transitionary species. It didn't just jump from this species to this, although sometimes it can happen with some drastic changes, but this shows that kind of gradualism aspect to natural selection. So how are they evidence? Fossils show that organisms have changed over time. So concretely, like it's actually, you can see it, it's fossilized, it's evidence that you can see. It shows that all organisms today have slowly evolved from earlier life forms. And again, I'm going to say that's mostly the case. You are going to mostly see this change over time, and that Earth has been around for 5 billion years. So it has had the time to allow for this slow change to happen. And it's also provided evidence in terms of age. So you can do radioactive dating to figure out how old those fossil records are. So not only does that give you a better understanding instead of just the law of superposition, but it gives you kind of concrete evidence as well that these transitions happen during this time period. And I think that's it for today. So I hope that that brought some clarity in terms of the evidence for this major theory of biology on evolution. So please submit your Google form when you are finished with these notes, and I will talk to you soon. Take care.